Hey everybody, I'm Carolyn Hadlock, and this is the Eunoia Podcast. Eunoia is the Greek word for beautiful thinking, and that's what the show is all about. I interview beautiful thinkers who are creatives, founders, authors, and CEOs, and I try to get inside their heads. So I just talked to Wes Rozen. He was an architect trained at Cooper Union, and his works range from corporate spatial planning and installations to artistic installations, and it really focuses on the space between the person and the structures that he designs and builds. Hey Wes, it's so nice to talk to you.
Yeah, hi. Thank you again for the interest, and I'm honored to be a part of the series.
I wanted to ask you about your studio. I saw a couple articles on it, which is beautiful because you guys live in there as well, right? You're in Brooklyn?
Yeah, so a couple of years ago, my wife and I were pregnant with our first boy, and thinking about what it meant to have children and how involved we wanted to be, and recognized that our current setup wasn't going to support that lifestyle very well. And right at that time when we were thinking about sort of how we were going to navigate all that, half of the building right next to my wife's space became available. And we spoke to the building owner and asked if we could take it on as a place to sort of build out a new studio and shop, and then also an apartment so that we could run two businesses and live all under one roof.
Yeah, I saw that you guys talked about that, the sort of the softening of intentionally softening the line between your work and your life. So I'm curious to hear. It sounds like you both are on the same page with that, and it sounds like it's a benefit for both of you guys and for your child.
Yeah. Well, we now have two boys who are moving through our workspace, and my wife Natalie and I are constantly tag teaming on taking care of the boys to taking care of work. And then also there's a community in Natalie's space, which is a shared workshop. That community is sort of an extension of our family as well. You know, our 2-year-old son, knows many of their names, and, they all know him, and he's constantly sort of in and out of the shop and playing with tools and taking scraps of wood, and, everyone loves it. And we're also starting to look at, buying some land outside of the city and looking at these models that actually are pretty common in more rural areas, where people have a farm operation that's connected to their home, and we see that sort of same smooth combination of work life and family life. And we're really trying to sort of bring that into an urban experience.
Well, and I would say your model is very COVID centric, even without meaning to be. So
yeah, we got lucky with that.
Yeah, it's easy to have those lines blur. Well, so your wife, you guys both went to Cooper Union, right? Is that where you met?
We did. Yep, and met in the shop.
So she's an artist.
Mm-hmm.
Is it other artists that she's sharing work with, or sculptors, or do you guys blend the lines there as well?
Yeah, in her space, it's a lot of people creating products, furniture makers, people making ceramics, sort of small businesses, single person operations. And yeah, she set up the space when she started to get into sculpture and furniture making. She was a painter for a long time, and then she started making these contraptions for painting, and had a need for a shop, and immediately found that there were a lot of other makers and craftspeople who had a need for a larger shop than they could afford on their own. And immediately sort of vibrant community flooded the space.
Yeah. Well, again, you guys are ahead of the curve. I think a lot of people are going to be doing a lot less commercial space and shared space in the future.
Yes.
Now, do you guys collaborate on projects together on your end?
Our home was certainly the first big collaboration. Creating children, I would say, is another big one. I would say tinker on things, the design of our apartment, something that certainly collaborated on. And, we built it ourselves. but yeah, we only had a couple months to build out the space before our first boy was born. So yeah, we quickly pulled a team together, and yeah, it was tons of fun.
And then, so tell me about Camber Studios, where that name came from, and the types of things that you have such a broad range of projects you work on.
Yeah, so the word camber is something that, one is just in sort of how you can put camber into material. At the time that I was starting to imagine my own practice, I was working on a sculpture project at my previous practice, and it was a suspended sculpture. And in order to get the piece to sort of fall into the correct shape, we had to build camber into the system that accounted for gravity. So that kind of camber is, something as a maker and designer is something that I'm always kind of looking for. And then I also have a deep love of airplanes and wind turbines, and there's camber in that curvature to create lift.
Okay.
And then also enjoy cars and driving. My father's a Porsche mechanic, and I grew up around cars, and he would talk about camber in roads and the sort of ideal curvature for maintaining speed as you go around a bend. And I also make films and these contraptions for moving cameras through space, and that sort of design around motion and movement also sort of gets at ideas sort of with camber.
I think in your more recent communications, you had described your shop as an architectural design and film company. So I was curious about the role of film, and that seems like an evolution from when you initially started.
Yeah, we were doing a lot around sort of design build and trying to communicate how things were made and built. With that, time lapse photography and documentation sort of became a big part of our sort of marketing efforts. And, it's very easy to put a time lapse camera on a mount in the corner of a room and sort of capture the activity, but it's pretty boring. And so to sort of break from the sort of conventional time lapse documentation, we got into building cable rigs and started looking at like drone photography like early on. Anyway, the documentation component of a lot of the projects became its own project.
I imagine your clients like it as well.
Yeah, you get another perspective, an experience in film that you can experience in person. One of the most successful film projects I did was around this installation that we did at the Brooklyn Museum, where we built these 20-foot tall columns. And to capture the construction work that we did there, we had this camera moving along a cable 20 feet in the air, and it ran through the space in this kind of zigzag pattern. And that video became part of the installation, where people could experience the installation from 20 feet in the air, moving along a straight line. So that like other dimension is something that I certainly get excited about. Also, just in film, we're often sort of breaking from the constraints of architecture. For example, I love that moment where you're like moving through a space in a way that we're accustomed to, but then you get to a wall or a window, say, and the camera goes beyond what we could do with our bodies, and there's that moment of, that gasp that happens when the camera just extends outside of
That gravity.
that. Yeah. And you can experience that little extension off of your body that I think is something that good art or good architecture strives for. That kind of pull, that tug, where you actually step into a painting or you are just pulled into a space, kind of tugs you out of your 5 to 6 foot experience that we're all constantly sort of inhabiting.
It kind of reminds me, one of the lines that you wrote that I was drawn to is the idea of being driven by grand ambitions and ventures into the unknown.
Yeah, I think it's, just breaking from convention. It's trying to find those opportunities that are between categories, between different modes of experience or practice. That space between two people, that space between a person and the space that they inhabit, between science and art, between making and drawing. It's that zone between where things can really sort of take off.
Where do you think that draw to the in between came from in your life?
Two things immediately come to mind. So I lived in I think it was 15 homes from when I was born to when I headed to college.
Wow.
Lived in 5 different states. And yeah, my mom was very nomadic, you could say. And so, yeah, I think with that movement, I had to sort of place myself and kind of figure out who I was between those different areas, and also between different groups of friends and schools and things like that. And then, I also went to this great school, Cooper, which I think really tries to break from convention to sort of find the poetry in art and architecture and even engineering. For 5 years of studying architecture there, I was really encouraged to find that space between that really sort of got into my bones.
Have you ever practiced conventional architecture, or did you kind of come out of Cooper sort of formed in the ways you are right now?
I would say probably formed in the ways I am now. I started situ with 3 friends right out of school. We actually started setting up the studio while we were students, and immediately sort of got into the sort of design build space and also research. Really got into some pretty amazing research projects with human rights groups, and that work continues today. I mean, while I was in college, I did internships at more conventional architecture firms, and actually kind of came out of that knowing that I wasn't really so interested in that type of professional pursuit. I definitely want to be doing more what might be considered conventional architecture, but I would say it'd be nice to do that work with clients who are looking for a slightly different approach or sort of coming into it outside of conventional routes.
Yeah. And you also talk about this idea of forced collaboration between across disciplines. Like, what are some of the more interesting cross-discipline things you've worked on, or the kind of people you've worked with?
Yeah, I guess go back to working with human rights groups to do forensics work. We would work with, say, Amnesty International or Witness to analyze videos, audio recordings of, say, protests or other sort of events where human rights were challenged. And then we would use architectural tools to render a spatial understanding of what took place in a otherwise very chaotic scene.
Wow. That's crazy. What does that mean? Like, how do you mean use architectural tools?
So, everyone's using their cameras on their phones, right? And especially in protest scenes to document what's going on. And these human rights groups are able to compile a lot of that data, and then they'll come to us and we will put all of that into something that we can then sort of manage and build into a 3D model. And then working with acoustics experts or video compilation experts, to sort of overlay little bits of information to render out something that makes sense. So creating a 3-dimensional model of a city and then rendering vectors of, say, tear gas or bullets. But anyway, using all of those tools that architects use for buildings every day to help a pretty cross-disciplinary group to be able to pull something together and then present it in court.
And is that meant to be like in addition or as a counter to sort of the evidence that the police would gather and provide on the same event?
Yeah. Just like any bit of evidence, in a lot of these cases, we would be presenting evidence against a government or a government agency. And the strategy for those government agencies was often to sort of claim that something was too chaotic or, there's just not concrete evidence around something. And so our mandate really was to quantify and render out whatever was being contested as clearly as possible so that it couldn't be disputed.
Wow. Because, it makes sense. You guys are sort of architecture's role is to understand how space is inhabited and how people move through space. And so this is just another version of space. It's kind of this pop-up space. You're working on a project right now that was it for size? I'm not saying that right. You're doing something with fabrication right now?
Cry?
Cry.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. They design and manufacture tactical gear for U.S. soldiers, U.S. and our allies. And it's led by friends who also went to Cooper. And they were doing a lot of industrial design work out of Cooper, won a military contract to develop a helmet for U.S. soldiers, which sort of opened the door into a lot of work for the armed forces. And they occupy this 85,000 square foot space in the Brooklyn Navy Yard where ships used to be built. Mm-hmm. And they gave us a call a little while ago to help them develop some amenity spaces for their staff. They have about 300 people that work there. And immediately in stepping into their space, it was clear that they needed some type of centerpiece, along with building out these little amenity spaces on like balconies that look into the main space.
Yeah, that's an interesting collaboration. And then I also see that you guys do a fair amount with an artist, Teresita.
Yeah, Teresita Fernandez. Yep.
Yeah, she's amazing. How did that happen? And you did the solarium project with her, or is that different?
Yep. So Teresita is a great artist that I've been working with for probably going on close to 10 years at this point. Yeah, she keeps us busy. One project goes right into the next, which is great, certainly for, building up a new practice and, having that consistency. But also, Teresita is a lot of fun to work with in that we know each other well. There's a lot of, mutual respect.
Yeah, she seems like she does like political statements. Is part of her design and your collaboration to create empathy for the experience that's happening elsewhere, using an installation to do that?
Yeah, I'd say that's a good way to summarize what she's usually doing. She's looking at how people in Latin America are being displaced by climate change and very difficult economic situations, and even things like drug wars and sort of things that are really sort of wreaking havoc in the Latin America world. And anyway, we created this large palm tree out of copper that's going to be suspended in the space. And then we're working on a project for BAM. And the idea is that this kind of stainless steel ivy growth, living in New York and Brooklyn, we see these sort of ivy growths up the side of buildings all the time. And so the idea is to create this growth on the side of the BAM Harvey Theater that sort of reaches out and becomes a canopy. And in mirror polished stainless, it'll reflect the surrounding area. So as you walk down Fulton and look up at this piece on the wall, you'll be able to see the reflection of Fulton. And then also just the light coming off of it and the caustic reflections will really sort of animate that space.
And I saw you with your son. Are you creating fort kits? Is that a COVID quarantine thing? I love that.
There's some talk of turning that into a product. I mean, that was just one of these, weekend projects. But yeah, I mean, everyone is spending a lot more time at home with their kids. And I think there's a real sort of market for, fort systems, and managed to carve out some time. Yeah, it'd be fun to turn that into a product, or at least produce enough of them that we can send them out to some friends.
Yeah, I definitely know some parents here that would sign on for that. Okay, 2 more questions. So, what's your dream project?
It's easy. I want to create a set of homes in a wind farm. I think wind energy and the turbines that are operating on an industrial scale are awesome, and you can actually be in close proximity to them in a way that you can't really do with any other industrial scale energy production or machinery. So just being close to wind turbines is something that I think is a pretty amazing experience, and I'd love to design homes that are within a wind farm, where you can sort of read the landscape through the turbines, understand something that's invisible, the wind passing through the landscape just through the speed of rotation of the turbines and the orientation. So being in a house within that sort of charged environment.
Would the homes be small? I mean, those things are massive.
Yeah. I could imagine at first just almost like cabins where people who share a similar joy in wind farms could rent one of these little cabins or stay these cabins for a longer, period of time. Maybe it's an artist residency or something along those lines. And then there's lots of different ways to integrate. Do you put the home, right at the base? That could be pretty intense with the sound and the shadow pattern and whatnot. So maybe one is close to the base, maybe a few of the other ones are spaced out away from the turbines. But yeah, you could sort of create different conditions throughout a landscape. And, I think it could also be framed as a project to better understand wind energy and sort of draw the public in to have an experience in a wind farm. A lot of people have driven past them and see them from a distance or see them in a commercial, but to actually spend a night in a wind farm or a summer, maybe there's a school group that spends a summer actually living in a wind farm. Interesting certainly for the people, but also for the wind industry. It's something that I can imagine them getting behind as a sort of wind park that brings people out to learn more about how that industry works.
Very cool. Yeah, so creating kind of an immersive environment for people to have understanding and affinity for something invisible.
Yep.
Great. Well, I hope you get to do that. That'd be amazing.
Yeah.
And okay, last question I always ask everybody is, how would you define beautiful thinking?
Yeah. I think it's when you think outside of yourself. When you to go back to something that we were talking about earlier in this conversation. It's that space between. And I think when people truly let go of themselves and sort of step into producing something for another person or occupying that space where they're fragile, but they are letting themselves sort of fall into it, letting themselves fall into an experience that's maybe out of their comfort zone, but they're embracing it, whatever it is, whatever that experience may yield, they trust that it's going to work out. So great film, great architecture, great art encourages people to get out of their comfort zones and share something.
Thank you so much for this conversation.
Awesome. Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Enjoy your day.
Yeah, you too.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as we did. And I hope you took something from it. Something that'll help you with your next meeting, next pitch, your next big project. But above all, I hope it inspires you to think strange, different, new, and beautiful thoughts. For more from this interview and other chats with beautiful thinkers, visit CarolynHadlock.com to subscribe on Medium and follow @Unoia Quarterly on Instagram. That's EUNOIA Quarterly.